All right. So let me start. Welcome to the second session of the CAU Cinema and Media Studies Colloquium. Today, I'm happy to host the talk by Professor Antonio Somaini. So before the start, let me introduce him briefly. And Professor Somaini is the professor of film, media, and visual culture theory at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. He's also a senior member of the Institut University of Paris, IUF, working on a research project that deals with the impact of AI technologies on images and contemporary visual culture. Among his latest publications, there is an article, Algorithm Images, Artificial Intelligence and Visual Culture, published in Grey Room in 2023, and the book Culture Visual Images Regards Media's Dispositive, in English, Visual Culture, Images, Media, Gauges, Dispositives, co-authored with Andrea Pinotti, published by the L'Espresse Real in 2022. He's also the chief curator of an exhibition on AI and contemporary art that will take place in April 2025 at the Judepom Museum in Paris. And he's also working on a new book entitled AI and Visual Culture, Machine Vision, and Latent Space, which is under contract with Amsterdam University Press, which is also the topic related to the topic of today's talk. The title of his talk is The Visible and the Sayable on Generative AI, Latent Space, and the Relation Between Images and Words. So please welcome Dr. Antonio Somaini.
Thank you very much to Jihong Kim for this invitation. I'm really very happy and honored to be part of this cycle. And I'm going to present a talk that will last about 40 minutes, and then I really look forward to our discussion. So I'll share now the screen. 1 second. Okay, is it everything okay, Jihun? Great. So the first part is entitled A Tectonic Shift in Contemporary Visual Culture. The history of visual cultures is periodically marked by the appearance of new images and new technologies of vision. In some cases, such changes produce only marginal transformations, which impact only limited areas of a specific visual culture, while in other cases, the transformations are vast tectonic shifts. This, I believe, is what is happening today in a historical phase in which a whole series of algorithms and models belonging to the vast field of AI are profoundly transforming the ways in which images are captured, generated, modified, and seen. Captured, to begin with, by cameras such as the ones that are installed in our latest smartphones that use deep learning algorithms to perform all kinds of operations that once belonged to the phase of post-production and now happen at the very moment in which images are taken. For example, turning each image into a machine-readable file containing all sorts of textual and numerical metadata, or fusing different snapshots taken at very short intervals of time into a single image through a technique called MEF, multiple exposure image fusion, in order to increase the sharpness, light contrasts, and the resolution. Editing images using different kinds of generative editing function, or instantly enhancing and correcting images according to aesthetic criteria stemming from the statistical analysis of users' preferences on social media platforms, as it happens regularly in the case of selfies. Or adding elements derived from stock image platforms, as in the famous case of the Samsung smartphone that added a stock image of the moon to replace the blurry image that one would otherwise obtain when trying to photograph the moon. Then generated by different deep learning algorithms and models, such as the generative adversarial networks introduced in 2014 and used to produce either highly photorealistic images, as the ones of the famous website This Person Does Not Exist from 2019, or hybrid and metamorphic images, as we can see in the works of different artists such as Trevor Paglen, Mario Klingemann, Pierre Huyghe, or Grigory Chatonsky. In 2022, as we all know, a new wave of generative models appeared with the release of text-to-image models such as Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 2, and Midjourney, all of which generate still images from textual prompts, sometimes combining a prompt with an image. In 2023 and 24, this wave was further intensified by the release of text-to-video models such as Gen 2 and then Sora by OpenAI, which can generate highly photorealistic videos lasting up to 1 minute, always starting from textual prompts or from a combination of images and prompts. Then images are modified by algorithms that can perform in increasingly automated ways different kinds of image operations, such as in-painting, that is changing something within a pre-existing image, out-painting, extending an image beyond its initial frame, upscaling, which is augmenting the degree of resolution of an image, aging and de-aging, or style transfer, transferring the style of an image to another one, plus all the image operations that may be produced through written prompts. Finally, AI technologies are transforming the way in which images are seen by machine vision systems that can detect, recognize, and classify objects, places, faces, and emotions across the billions of images that are accessible online, even when they do not appear on screens and are therefore invisible to human eyes. A new form of non-human vision, which is profoundly different from human vision, since it is based on artificial neural networks, such as the convolutional neural networks, that perform mathematical operations of pixel analysis. A new algorithmic gaze, we could say, which has been leading us for a few years now into a new visual culture in which, as the artist Trevor Paglen has underlined in essays such as Invisible Images, Your Pictures Are Looking at You, images are no more meant to be seen only by human eyes and often are produced by machines for other machines without humans being included in the loop. All these transformations raise a series of key aesthetic, epistemological, historical, and political questions for studies on image and visual culture and for disciplines such as art history, photography, film, and media studies. They also invite us, as this conference can also help us elaborate, to rethink the very ideas of creativity and human creativity from the perspective of the multiple interactions, intertwinings, collaborations, and codependencies between human and non-human agencies that AI technologies have introduced. In what follows, I will focus on one aspect of these current transformations, as I would like to show one of the most striking effects of the impact of AI algorithms and models on images and visual culture is the fact that they are profoundly reorganizing the relations between images and words, between the visible and the sayable, between what can be seen and what can be said. This transformation, in turn, is introducing new ways to process, explore, and transform the vast quantities of cultural objects that exist in digital form and that have been uploaded on the internet. What is at stake, therefore, is not only the relationship between images and words, between the visible and the sayable, but also our relation to the past, to cultural history, and to cultural memory. Interpreted in this perspective, what is happening is a profound shift that has no precedent in the history of visual cultures. And I believe that a key factor in these current transformations caused by AI technologies is played by what is known in machine learning as latent space. The theory of visual culture today, I believe, needs a theory of latent space. Let me now move to part 2, which is entitled The New Algorithmic Connections Between Images and Words. I will begin this second part of my talk by quoting a famous passage by the American experimental filmmaker Stan Brakhage, taken from his Metaphors of Vision, published in 1963 in the journal Film Culture. Here is the passage. Imagine an eye unruled by man-made laws of perspective, an eye unprejudiced by compositional logic, an eye which does not respond to the name of everything, but which must know each object encountered in life through an adventure of perception. How many colors are there in a field of grass to the crawling baby unaware of green? How many rainbows can light create for the untutored eye? How aware of variations in heat waves can that eye be? Imagine a world alive with incomprehensible objects and shimmering with an endless variety of movement and innumerable gradations of color. Imagine a world before in the beginning was the Word. The opening lines of Stan Brakhage's Metaphors of Vision are often quoted as one of the clearest formulations of an idea that runs through the history of our theories and that keeps on reappearing at different moments in time. The idea of a radical autonomy of vision and images from language and from the act of naming. For more than 10 years now, AI technologies dealing with vision and images have been leading us in the exact opposite direction, towards a new visual culture in which seeing is inseparable from naming and in which images are produced through written language. We can see this happening in the two vast fields of so-called discriminative AI and generative AI. In the case of discriminative AI, we have an entire array of computer vision and machine vision technologies that are capable of detecting, recognizing, and naming the objects that appear in front of a camera or are represented in images. They do so after having been trained with large data sets, such as ImageNet, which played a key role in the development of machine vision in the early 2010s. In it, 14 million of images were organized in over 21,000 categories after having been individually labeled with English nouns following the WordNet hierarchy. As Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen have shown in exhibitions such as Training Humans and in essays such as Excavating AI, The Politics of Images in Machine Learning Training Sets, the original intention behind ImageNet was to map out the entire world of objects. And such mapping was done by systematically coupling images and nouns. As a consequence, what a machine vision system trained with a data set such as ImageNet can see is what it has learned to identify and name, while the rest lies in an indefinite nameless background, as it happens for the asphalt, the trees, and the sky in this image. In the case of generative AI, we have the text-to-image and text-to-video models I already mentioned. After having been trained with billions of text-image pairs scraped from the internet and gathered in huge data sets such as Lion 5B, these models allow users to generate still and moving images from prompts written in natural language. The most recent versions of this model add to the original text-to-image function the reverse one, image to text, allowing users to automatically generate textual descriptions of given images. This is what happens with the DALL-E 3, which is now fully integrated in ChatGPT, and with Midjourney with the function called Describe. Both these aspects of AI's current impact on images and texts are leading us into a new landscape in which images and words are more and more inseparable. A new visual culture in which the visible and the sayable are algorithmically connected. With machine vision systems, what can be seen depends on what can be named. And with text-to-image and text-to-video models, what can be visualized depends on what can be written. Let us now focus on these recent text-to-image and text-to-video models, asking ourselves whether everything can be written and whether with these models everything can be visualized. Or are there limits, whether explicit or implicit, transparently declared or opaquely controlled, that frame the visible and the sayable? And this leads to me to part 3, entitled Banned Prompts, Default Styles, and Censored Images. Now, if we look again at the interfaces of the most popular text-to-image models, DALL-E 3, Midjourney, or Stable Diffusion, which is here accessed through a platform called Dream Studio, one would get the impression that there are no limits to what can be written and to what can be visualized. The space for writing prompts is empty and invites users to write whatever they feel like. The generated images appear in a very short time and in groups of 4, giving the idea of an endless generative potential, while at the same time treating the images themselves as a cheap, disposable material. As we all know, of course, these models are instead full of limitations, which have been steadily increasing since their first release. Different words, whose complete list is never provided, cause the model to block, as it happened to me yesterday when I asked DALL-E 3 to generate an image of Donald Trump on trial in a courtroom. The response was that the model cannot generate this image. Pre-prompts and hidden prompts are also covertly added to the user's prompts in order to push the image generation process in certain directions rather than others. Different models seem to have their own default styles and style parameters, as it happens typically with Midjourney, making it difficult for users to move away from them. Social, race, and gender biases appear and disappear, as you can see here with the images I generated with the prompt, the CEO of a company, and whether Stable Diffusion visualizes only white men in their 30s and 40s, DALL-E 2, which I used a few months ago, produced a wider range of persons. Some generated images are also blurred by the models themselves after they have been generated. Here I used the prompt, a swimming pool full of blood, and I got 4 images, 3 of which are blurred, and another prompt was an Italian pizza, among other typical Italian food, and 2 out of 4 images were also blurred, probably because of the color of the tomato sauce. So in other cases, the models even censor their own description of images. In this case, I asked ChatGPT 3 to give me a description of Picasso's Guernica, and the description was provided, but it was immediately labeled by the model itself as a description that violated its own policies. So the model itself can generate content that spontaneously, algorithmically, that it then censors. So generative AI models, in other words, are full of limits, no-go zones, embedded biases, default styles, all of which keep on changing according to opaque and inaccessible criteria. Wide quantities of images can simply not be generated nor described, introducing new forms of image censorship, which prolong in new and uncharted ways the old history of iconophobia and iconoclasm. The reasons of all this become clear if we look a bit more closely at these generative AI models, considering their structure, their processes, as well as the data sets that have been used to train them. The training sets in particular play a crucial role in determining what images this model can or cannot generate. And since OpenAI has not released precise information about the data sets that were used to train the various versions of DALL-E and the newly released Sora, we need to turn to Lion 5B, a vast open source dataset of 5 billion text image pairs that was released in March 2022 by Lion, a German non-profit organization that is, and a dataset that is known for having been used to train both Stable Diffusion and Midjourney and probably many other image-generating AI models. Some researchers consider Lion 5B as a foundational dataset for generative AI, a dataset which, if used for the training of an AI model, is meant to give it a comprehensive representation of the world. Its role in the process of generating images from prompts could hardly be underestimated. A recent study on Lion 5B, published by Christo Buschek and Yair Thorpe on the website knowingmachines.org, gives us an unprecedented insight into the structure and the content of this dataset, contributing to the crucial field of dataset investigation and to the goal of an increased dataset transparency. As we read from this report, the 5 billion text image pairs contained in Lion 5B were scraped from the internet through Common Crawl and then organized and structured hierarchically according to a number of criteria. First criterion was the presence of HTML alt attributes, which are systematically present in platforms such as Pinterest, Shopify, or Slide Player, which were included massively in Lion 5B. Then another criterion was the choice of privileging alt attributes, which another foundation model, CLIP, identified as most closely matching the contents of the image. Third criterion, the choice of giving a priority to the English language, which counts for more than 50% of the text-image pairs that are contained in Lion 5B. Fourth criterion, prioritizing the images contained in a subset called Lion aesthetics, a subset including images that were statistically identified as having a high visual quality and which, as the investigation shows us, actually came in large part from a small number of datasets, such as the simulacra aesthetic captions and aesthetic visual analysis, both of which contain vast quantities of images from rather small groups of users on platforms such as dpchallenge.com, mostly located in the US and with clearly identifiable social milieu and aesthetic tastes. As the authors of the study write, the concepts of what is and isn't visually appealing can be influenced in outsized ways by the tastes of a very small group of individuals and the processes that are chosen by dataset creators to curate the datasets. Training sets are, of course, not the only reason that explains why the AI-generated images look the way they look. Other crucial factors come into play, and they have to do with the various steps involved in the process of image generation. Stable diffusion, for example, is a latent diffusion model that generates still images from text and works in two coordinate main steps: text encoding and image generation. First, a text encoder converts the words of the prompt into a token, a number, with a clip tokenizer, and then turns the token into a 762 value vector called embedding, which allows it to be processed by a text transformer. Then an image generator, a deep learning model called the diffusion model, which works through both forward diffusion and reverse diffusion, through noising and denoising, generates an image that corresponds to the latent representation of the prompt. A crucial role in this process is the one played by different kinds of latent spaces, also called latent feature spaces or embedding spaces, both in the phase of text encoding and in the phase of image generation. The words contained in the prompts are turned into vectors by a text encoder of a clip model, a model which, after having been trained through large quantities of connected texts and images, learns how to encode and embed both of them in a common latent space, where they can be analyzed and compared, thereby integrating natural language processing and image processing. Forward and reverse diffusion, noising and denoising do not happen in the high-dimensional image space, also called pixel space, but rather in a lower dimensional latent space into which images have been compressed through a variational autoencoder. This process of compression, which is lossy and not lossless, tries as much as possible to keep the essential information. It is now on the role of these latent spaces that I would like to focus my attention in part 4, entitled Latent Spaces as a New Key Factor in Contemporary Visual Culture. Different kinds of latent spaces, as we have just seen, play a crucial role in generative AI models. At different stages in the image generating process, they are the spaces in which these models turn the high-dimensional input data, be they text or images, into lower dimensional compressed representations made of vectors in order to learn their meaningful aspects and process them. Interpreting the concept of latent space in a broader sense, we could say that every generative AI model, be they generative adversarial networks, variational autoencoders, multimodal diffusion models, produces new data out of its own latent spaces. The still or moving images that can be generated by GANs or by text-to-image or text-to-video models, for example, can be considered to be visualization of single data points or interpolations between data points, trajectories connecting data points that may be close to one another or distant from one another in latent space. Latent spaces, as I would like to argue, play today a key role in a visual culture more and more infiltrated by generative AI models. They are the multidimensional, abstract, unintuitive, unperceivable, unimaginable spaces into which these models turn the digital objects that have been given to them, for example, text and images, into numerical vectors in order to learn their underlying patterns, act upon them, and then generate new digital objects. Written prompts are a way of activating these latent spaces. They operate like search queries. They point to a specific area in latent space, to a specific group of data points, and therefore lead to the generation of certain images rather than others. The process, though, is not straightforward. The data points are so many that the same prompt, if repeated, can generate endless series of slightly different images. Latent spaces, for these reasons, are like almost limitless repositories of possible images. Their latency has many metaphorical connotations. For example, it can be referred to the latent image in photography or to the idea of latency in the unconscious in psychoanalysis, but it is not a latency that is purely metaphorical. It refers both to the multiple features of the digital cultural objects that have been left out in the process of their encoding and embedding, but also to the latent space's intrinsic black box nature, the fact that its structure and its inner workings are, at least for now, hidden and radically inaccessible. Within our culture, latent spaces act more and more as filters that process the vast quantities of cultural objects that have been uploaded on the internet after having turned them into latent space representations, and therefore after having dissolved the differences between their original mediums into just one type of data, numerical vectors. It is in these latent spaces that texts and still or moving images are encoded. It is within them that they are processed, and it is out of them that texts, still, and moving images emerge. Let me now move to part 5, prompts as search queries in latent spaces. As I said before, prompts, here we see the opening page of DALL-E 2, which has now been deactivated, operate like search queries into the latent spaces of generative AI models. Each word they contain activates different areas of these latent spaces and therefore contributes to the generation of certain images rather than others. With prompts, language becomes a new medium for image production in a completely unprecedented way. The images that are generated by a text-to-image and text-to-video model are different from any previous example of a written language becoming images. They are neither the pictorial realization of a textual iconographic program, as for the life of Christ in this polyptych, nor a becoming image of language, as in calligrams and visual poetry, nor the visualization of textual descriptions that in the tradition of conceptual art have often been presented as the artwork itself, as we see in the case of these pieces by Yoko Ono and by Lawrence Weiner. With their active role in the production of images, prompts act as a new kind of speech acts, showing once more how language may be operative and performative, how it can become a form of action producing concrete effects in the world. Prompts can also be considered to be a form of operative ekphrasis, a term I take from Hannes Bajor, an ekphrasis that does not describe pre-existing images, but rather generates images by pre-describing them. Prompts are also a form of a remediation, a term I take here from J.D. Bolter and Richard Rosen. A remediation which turns the entire history of visual media with their material supports, their techniques, operations, as well as their protagonists, styles, traditions, their different historical phases, the discourses surrounding them, into a wide array of nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, as well as proper names that may be used to probe into latent space. We can visualize this through a kind of word cloud. In the years to come, if text-to-image and text-to-media models become a dominant form of image production, the greater the knowledge of all the terms, of all the language related to the history, theory, and practice of visual media, the greater the possibility of steering text-to-image and text-to-video models in non-standard ways through latent space. And the same is valid for the other multimodal generative AI system, all based on the premise text-to, text-to-image, text-to-video, text-to-sound, and soon text-to a combination of all these elements. Let me now move to part 6, entitled Prompts, Latent Spaces, and the Cultural Archive. The latent spaces of generative AI models are destined to play a greater and greater role in cultural processes and may be interestingly considered in relation to the concept of the archive. They are the multidimensional spaces in which vast quantities of cultural objects that have been uploaded on the internet have been disassembled into fragments and then turned into vectors, positioned in relation to one another, and then processed in order to generate new cultural objects. Latent spaces, in other words, are becoming more and more the spaces in which culture is processed, explored, and transformed. And if the internet is more and more the vast, messy archive of our cultural memory, then the latent spaces of generative AI models are like archives of possibilities. What they store are vast, unimaginable quantities of possible texts and images, only some of which will materialize in a perceivable form. This is why so many artists during the last few years have been interested in using various generative AI models, from GANs to text-to-image models, to explore history, memory, and the archive in unprecedented ways, using these models to visualize alternative pasts, counterfactual histories, imaginary archives, playing with the undefined, unstable, uncanny temporal status of AI-generated images. In so doing, they use the existing latent spaces in singular, non-standard ways, showing how it is possible to move away from default styles and repetitive cliché, finding within latent spaces possibilities that have not yet been explored. Among the many examples that come to mind, we can think, for example, of the artist Egor Kraft, with his series entitled Content-Aware Studies, started in 2018 and continuing up to today. Egor Kraft has taken as a starting point a series of fragmentary sculptures from classical antiquity and the Hellenistic period, and has then trained the GAN model, trained with a data set of similar sculpture, to generate parts that could somehow complete these fragmentary objects. The AI image generation, which we see here in movement in one of the videos that accompany the installation, is here used to somehow process history and repair it or complete it in a way, adding those fragments that have been lost in time. Other artists, such as, for example, Nora Al-Badri, in her installation entitled Babylonian Visions, have worked on historical data sets of artworks stemming from Western museums with a kind of decolonial attitude. Nora Al-Badri focused on museum collections in the West containing vast series of objects from the Babylonian and Mesopotamian tradition, and then used GANs to somehow explore the latent spaces of these collections. Once again, the images that we see are interpolation within latent spaces, visualization of the almost limitless number of images, of variations of images that this model can generate, and she considers this as a form, in a way, of decolonial strategy to somehow counter the fact that all these objects ended up in museums located in the West, when actually the objects came from Iraq, where she's originally from. These are also, some of the images that are generated by the video in Babylonian Visions. Another example is the one of two artists from Cyprus, Alexia Achilleos and Theopistis Styliano Lambert, and in their archive of unnamed workers, they used GANs to generate the faces of the anonymous workers, the many anonymous workers from Cyprus, who during the late 19th and early 20th century worked in the various archaeological sites of the island. So in this case, generative AI is used to generate missing images, images that never existed, but that could have documented the existence and the labor, the fundamental labor of these anonymous and forgotten people. Another example is the one of the French artist Grégory Chatonsky, who in his writings, which you can find on his website, has often described latent spaces as the multidimensional vector spaces in which vast quantities of our cultural memory have been embedded and processed, and out of which new cultural forms may emerge. Forms which could have existed but did not exist, forms which have an eerie resemblance to actually existing objects without ever coinciding with them. In recent works, such as La ville qui n'existait pas, in English, the city that did not exist, he used stable diffusion to process and transform the photographic archive of the French city of Le Havre, visualizing three different phases of the different possible counterfactual history of the city. There's a first section entitled the latent spaces that goes from 1895 to 1944, the year in which the city was very heavily bombed during the Allied arrival in Normandy. The second part is called the architecture of the possibles, and it goes from 1945, the year in which the reconstruction of the city began, to 1970. And the third part is called logistics, and it's related to the year 1971. And in all these cases, Chatonsky used the photographic archive of a city, trained latent space with it, and then generated images that somehow mixed both technological and natural objects, but also buildings, people from different historical moments, then spreading all these images in different formats throughout the city. And I can add that a new version of this project will be presented this summer, opening just in a couple of weeks. I can also mention then the two French artists, Gweno Lavagon and Pierre Cassonogues, who in their latest film entitled Chronicles of the Black Sun used Midjourney and Stable Diffusion to develop a dystopian narrative inspired by Chris Marquer's photographic film La Jetée, and in which generative AI models are used to expand and transform an archive of family photographs. Finally, I could mention another French artist and filmmaker, Éric Bulot, who took as a starting point the unfinished text Le Cinéma Vivant, the living cinema, written in the early 1930s by the French surrealist writer Saint-Paul Roux, and used the text-to-image model called Lexica to visualize some of Saint-Paul Roux's utopian visions of a cinema that expands beyond the closed space of movie theaters in order to become a sort of a cosmic spectacle within which the sun becomes the projector. So let me now move to my conclusion entitled Latent Spaces as a New Historical A Priori, a question I'd like to raise in finishing my paper. Generative AI models are introducing in our contemporary visual culture a new key factor, latent spaces. What we have now and what we will increasingly have in the future is a series of different latent spaces competing for human attention and for cultural dominance. Controlling the latent spaces of image-generating AI models has crucial political implications. It is a way of controlling the place, the meaning, and the agency that images may have within a given culture. It means controlling the possibilities of visualization, the lines that separate what can from what cannot be seen. It implies the possibility of intervening in the cultural and political dynamics that govern the storing, processing, and transmission of images through time. It also gives the ability of imposing dominant visual styles, making it difficult for users to avoid them. In his book on Foucault, in the chapter entitled Strata or Historical Formations, the Visible and the Articulable, Gilles Deleuze tried to sum up in this way the relations between the visible and the sayable in the epistemes or historical formations analyzed by the author of The Order of Things and the Archaeology of Knowledge. Here are two quotations from his book. Historical formations, writes Deleuze, are made up of things and words, of seeing and speaking, of the visible and the sayable, of fields of visibility and fields of legibility. And then each historical formation sees and makes visible all it can within the conditions laid down for visibility, just as it says all it can within the conditions relating to statements. Deleuze pointed out in this way to the presence in Foucault's thought of the idea of a historical a priori, the existence across different historical phases of a priori conditions of possibility that determine what can be seen and what can be said. In the years to come, it is highly likely that the conditions laid down for visibility and the conditions relating to statements will be more and more established by the competing conflictual latent spaces of generative AI models that will circulate across cultures. Language in the form of prompts will become more and more the medium through which these latent spaces will be activated. And within this new landscape, I believe that the role of artists in exploring in non-standard ways the existing dominant latent spaces or producing their own alternative, antagonist, and counter-hegemonic latent spaces will be essential. Thank you very much. I end here, and I'll be delighted to now discuss this with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for rich, the rich, the very wide, comprehensive, but insightful, talk on the implications of generative AIs, on the ways that they change and restructure the history of our visual culture that include painting, photography, and by extension, cinema. So, and that I'd like to make a brief comment on what when your talk posing. I also posing a couple of questions before we open the floor for the discussion with the participants. And one thing I definitely support and like about your talk is your emphasis of latent space as essential to understanding how generative AI models work and what kind of impact they have on reorganizing and restructuring the relationship between image and text, or the visible and the sayable, and other impact on the generation and understanding of texture and visual media. So I highlight that point because there are some in my view there are some opposing views on the implications of generative AI, and for some of those who critically engage the harmful and biased kind of impact of generative AI, they tend to highlight the primacy of training data. So if the training data are already biased, their text and image, text image, the combinations are already biased according to racial or gender and those kind of stereotypes. These biases are directly, inscribed in the resulting, output data that people get in using generative AI. So there are many examples on these examples. Many examples, including Bloomberg's, investigative report on how stable diffusion produces a bunch of very stereotypical images about different occupations, such as pilot, house workers, etc. According to the inherent bias, the biases in the data sets used for training of the model. And there are many examples on like this. So they tend, so for those who are concerned with that, harmful effect, they tend to highlight that, okay, the generative AI is already plagued with the epistemological and political, incorrectness of the image text data sets. So what we get from this model is the result of is only the result of the statistical correlation between trained data. So the trained data primarily determines what you get. But I don't think this is not actually true, because like you said, latent space are the hover between latent spaces, and the generation of image text pair hover between some kinds of determining correlations and a degree of indeterminacy in terms of which data point are assembled into the resulting image that we used. We get in using stable diffusion, mid-journey, and other text-to-image generation models. So there are kind of not only determining factors are primarily governed by some governed by the problems inherent in data sets, and other kinds of indeterminacy inherent in the pattern distribution vectorized as the sum of vectors in the latent space. So definitely latent space is crucial, like you said, in determining what is visible and what is sayable and how they are correlated. So in that sense, I definitely like the idea of linking the latent space to the new historical a priori, as highlighted by Foucault's work on archaeology and the role of archive. By extension, due to emphasis on Foucault's idea. And at the same time, I also added to this is I want to highlight is Jacques Rancière, because his idea of the distribution of the sensible means that in different regimes of representation and aesthetics, this regime change is closely linked to the shifting distribution of the visible and the invisible, and the sayable and the unsayable. With this concept, what he suggests is that the distribution of sensible is not simply aesthetic, but also political. So the political and aesthetic in the production of any texture, any media object, it is very crucial in to think about how the visible and the sensible are distributed, and how the two are linked. So I think there's the linking of generative AI and their new relationship between text and image to Rancière's idea of distribution of sensible is highly suggestive, because distribution in that sense is not simply is closely linked to the shifting correlation of the aesthetic and political, and this is also linked to the pattern distribution of data that is integral to the operation of latent spaces. So definitely, so I think your talk allows us to think of how to theorize the specificity of generative AI. And I also like your distinction between discriminative AI and generative AI in terms of how they are. But I also ask you as a first question, I want you to elaborate more on the relationship between the two models of AI, in terms of how generative AI, what kind of relationship the generative AI has with its predecessor, I mean the discriminative AI, and how they are different, and in what ways the generative AI models are distinct from the discriminative AI that is primarily used for scientific or administrative or political uses, including image recognition and face recognition? This is my first question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ji-hoon, for such rich and insightful questions that I've taken a lot of notes because they really gave me a lot of things to think. So it is certainly true that training data plus all the different weights that different generative AI models assign to prompts, to images, and so on, play a huge role, which is aesthetic and politic, in determining what kind of images can or cannot be generated. There's no doubt about it. At the same time, if one looks closely at the way in which artists are working with this model, one can also see situations in which these biases, although they are there, that can be somehow overcome, dodged, escaped from, and so on. The images, for example, that Éric Bulot generated for his project entitled Le Cinéma Vivant, Living Cinema, were generated with Lexica, which I think is one of the versions of Stable Diffusion because it's open access. And he generated them simply through prompts. No fine-tuning, nothing, just explorations of the latent space as it is given, trying to go and find areas of this latent space in which you can generate images that stay away from all the cliches, the biases, and so on that have been so many times emphasized. In other cases, artists such as Gregory Chatonsky decide also to start from existing latent spaces, but to add to the ontology of these latent spaces other entities, new individuals, new bodies, new faces, new gestures, new materials, new spaces, new textures. And all of that can be done through different forms of fine-tuning, including the so-called LoRa, low-rank adaptation techniques, which allow artists and programmers to insert new entities within a given space and connecting it to prompts. So, for example, he was capable of inserting images of himself into the latent space of Stable Diffusion and to generate through the prompt Chatonsky, which did not exist before. Before his intervention, this prompt would not generate any image of himself. This means that some latent spaces, not all of them, have some degrees of plasticity. They can be expanded. They can be somehow, at least in part, altered. Stable Diffusion, of course, is the one that has most plasticity of all because it's open access. But even in Midjourney and in DALL-E 3, which is now integrated in ChatGPT, you can somehow expand the latent space even a tiny bit if you start not only from prompts, but if you start from prompts and from images. The image you insert, in a way, introduces a new element in the equation. Midjourney now also has a function called blend, which allows you to give it from 3 to 5 images and ask the model to somehow merge them. And this is also a way to work in a kind of original non-standard way with the latent spaces. So I think that emphasis on bias is very important, but it should not hide the possibility of actually using these models in ways that are non-stereotypical and non-standard. The reference to Jacques Rancière is great. Thank you so much for highlighting this, because absolutely what latent spaces produce are different forms of partage du sensible, of distribution of the sensible. There's no doubt about it. And this was somehow implicit in what I was saying, that controlling latent spaces is a way of controlling what can or cannot be seen. And of course, since latent spaces are becoming more and more multimodal and can generate not only images, but connections between images and texts, and also soon voices and sounds, it is really going to be about new distributions and articulation of the sensible. Now I come to your last question, discriminative AI and generative AI. Discriminative AI has developed, of course, before the explosion of the field of generative AI. It is linked to all the systems of in the field of images, machine vision, face recognition, object detection, and so on and so on. But also in the case of discriminative AI, you do have some forms of latent spaces, because models such as the convolutional neural networks, what they do in analyzing an image is begin with kind of low-level features and then move up and up and up to higher level features, and somehow producing a latent space that only keep the essential traits of the images that is analyzed in order to then produce the actual classification. So latent spaces are present also in discriminative AI models. The two are intrinsically connected. Generative AI could not develop with some of the algorithms and deep learning techniques of discriminative AI. And certainly, there's also a very strong dimension in generative AI, because these dominant models do, and I'm talking about, you know, the ones by OpenAI, Midjourney, Google, and all the other ones that are going to come, do play a huge political role, not only in the way in which they favor certain styles and not others, but also in somehow conveying to the public a certain idea of AI in general. This idea of AI as infinite generativity, infinite creativity, some kind of a recent AI art, so to say, could also be considered a form as a giant advertising for a certain kind of a certain vision of AI. So this is what I would answer to these first questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So your answer is in line with my, my thought that one of the most crucial consequences of generative AI is that the impact of AI so with the advent of various image generation models and text generation models, the AI has expanded from the technique or mediation or socio-technical mediation into what I mean by traditional media, including the photography, painting, and cinema. So this is what I've been highlighting in my work on generative AI. And in relation to this, my second and brief question is more speculative, but definitely we can think about the impact of generative AI on cinema. And although you draw on the examples of Gregory Shatonsky and Eric Bureau and some others, and currently the advent of Sora and other most up-to-date text-to-video technologies has demonstrated that they are able to generate very photorealistically traceable images which take 1 minute or so, and even there are some videos based on the sequences, combination of sequences produced by the prompt that are linked to some comments and some description. So the combination of the sequences generated by those models are incorporated into 3 to 4 minute music video. We have seen many of these examples now, but the more future speculation about generative AI's impact on cinema is it possible for any kind of future generative models to run and operate what I mean by cinematic montage, which means that so the generative AI models can be trained with best amount of YouTube videos or other kinds of videos coupled with text-based text, but are these models able to run the rich and best variation of montage techniques that exist in the history of cinema? I'm asking about this because the impact of generative AI on the production of moving image is it can be used for upgrading or updating the techniques of detailed visual effects in the domain of computer graphics, as generative AI models are incorporated in painting, upscaling, and the color corrections and other techniques that are used for the post-production techniques in the domains of feature films. But are they able to run other the techniques of montage that as the most defining element of cinema in its more standard senses, in its standard senses? So I'm thinking of Christian Metz, the early works, including the range of cinema. Definitely, the Metz is one of the French thinkers who were very interested in cybernetics. So in his early writings, he definitely delved into the question of how to classify the older underlying rules of montage that related to the production of the feature-length narrative films. His conclusion is that the cinema, as you know, is language without rank, the language without rules. So I think in the current stage, the cinema, as you know it, based on the art of montage, remains as, in a sense, resistant to what generative AI is doing. So this is my current, speculation about the impact of generative AI and its possible future in current state. So I was wondering about your view on the ways that generative AI affect other dimensions of cinema than their incorporation of detailed visual effects and generation of moving image sequences.
Thank you very much, Ji-hoon, also for this second question. I think that if in the first couple of years, let's say between 2022 and now, the focus has been mostly on the impact of generative AI models on still images. What we see now is this impact affecting more and more the field of moving images, and it will be more and more so as we move on. And cinema, of course, is going to also be deeply affected by all this. I participated recently in a whole day at the French Cinémathèque here in Paris with a representative from various areas of film production, screenwriting, special effects, acting, dubbing. And they were all saying that different AI models are really slowly infiltrating all the areas of film production today. There's not one single area that is not, for the moment, untouched, and it will be more and more so. I would add that the question of montage that you raised is, for me, one of the most interesting things to monitor moving forward. We already have a number of artists and video makers that have used generative AI models to produce videos of a certain length, which already present extremely interesting forms of montage. You could do montage already with GANs before, and you could trace trajectories within latent space that through this kind of typical GAN morphings would move from an image to another, from an area of latent space to another. And that in itself, for me, is already a form of montage. Is montage as interpolation in latent space. Montage as the planning of trajectories within latent spaces. What is interesting is that this kind of montage has very important elements of chance. It is impossible, even when you program the kind of trajectory that you want, to know exactly what images will come out. You can only judge afterwards. And now we have, of course, the new text-to-video models, which for the moment can generate only shots of a few seconds. Sora can go up to 1 minute, but is not available yet. And in trying to respond to your question, I think that it will probably be possible to start from some of these open access models and then do fine-tuning with a corpus of films that you may want to select as a presence with a certain weight in the latent space you're operating onto. Already today, ChatGPT allows you to do fine-tuning with a specific corpus of texts that can be taken from any source, so that the model writes in a style or with a content that is strongly influenced by the texts of this fine-tuning. And you can also, in ChatGPT, you can also ask the model to write a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare, or a passage in the style of Melville, and so on. And I think this will be possible, of course, also with the new models generating videos. It's all up to see still, because we don't have them yet, but I think it will be very, very interesting to see what happens there and how filmmakers and artists are going to use these tools.
Thank you. So let us open the floor for the accepting probably a couple of questions or a little more. And I've seen Rep Manovich holding his virtual hand icon for your comment and questions. So Rep, great to see you here. And so pose any question or comment on Antonio.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so lucky to catch this talk. I'm in Dresden right now, spinning against summer in Korea. So I think Antonio is the most elegant and precise theorist we have today of visual generative AI. But having said that, let me add 3 kind of footnotes. Number one, so I think it's important to point out, right, that the concept of latent space is not new, but in fact, it has been already quite central to 20th century statistics, and then it becomes even more central to machine learning, and then from machine learning, it enters into AI. Specifically, I'm thinking about principal component analysis, which has been one of the key statistical technique, and that was introduced in 1901. And then later we have multidimensional scaling and latent analysis, etc., etc. So in fact, in digital humanities, which develops and becomes very important across humanities in the late 2000s, people have already done lots of analytical work with big cultural data using these techniques, and it's important because we have some theory to rely upon, So latent space in generative AI functions a bit differently, but fundamental idea is the same, The fundamental idea is that you take a data set, you're extracting some features from the data objects, and you're projecting these features in a new space where the coordinates of the space are no longer meaningful, are no longer understandable, are no longer clear, but this allows for various operations such as classification, cluster analysis, and now for the first time, we have a new operation which is generating data points which interpolate between existing data points. So, so I just want to point this out, right? I think it's important. The second thing is, so I think Antonio, you very, elegantly, very powerfully, kind of take the latent space as the central concept, as both a metaphor and a kind of practical reference, as opposed to using, let's say, more prosaic term AI model, and that's that's fine. I think, but what my kind of, let's say, comment in the question is, you also make a big deal out of a text-to-image model, and I think this may change, because not only Midjourney but also many other implementations of generative AI models, right, allow for, let's say, image-to-image model, so that in Midjourney you can add images to your prompt. Right, there's a whole family of model, image to 3D, music to 3D, etc., etc. And for example, in Midjourney, which is ahead of others, we also have now in version 6 so-called SREF, where basically the network, you can give it any image, it can extract a style from this image and apply it, right, for new generation, and this kind of bypasses the language. So what I'm trying to say is that I think maybe for the masses, right, for the normal people who don't have visual literacy, perhaps text to image, text to music, text to anything will remain the dominant mode. But for professionals, right, for filmmakers, designers, and so on, who are visually literate, I think these other modes of engaging the latent space perhaps will become more important, right? For example, in my case, very often I don't use any text prompt, right? I just use multiple images and kind of force Midjourney to remix them, and this allows me to kind of bypass some of the stereotypical qualities. So while the latent space idea, dimension reduction, compression, right, some other fundamental ideas will remain, because these ideas have been already fundamental to machine learning and multidimensional statistics for 120 years, and you can't do machine learning without reduction. Perhaps in the professional sphere, at least, the importance of text-to-image model may become less. Anyway, so this is just, I'm just speculating like all of us. So Antonio, if you have any comments, of course, I'm looking forward to your book where I'll probably find answers to all these questions. But anyway, wanted to just say that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lev. First of all, thank you for attending the talk. It's wonderful to have you there. And thank you also for these two questions, which are absolutely right. I completely agree. Latent space, of course, is absolutely not new. It's been a key concept to machine learning and deep learning for a long time. And you're absolutely right in the fact that it has already played an important role in the forms of big data cultural analysis, of which you yourself have been one of the protagonists for now already many years. What I wanted to highlight was the importance of this entity in relation to generative AI, which instead, as we know, at least in its widespread form, is a rather new phenomenon. And in this case, latent space is not only a form of classification, cluster analysis, big data visualization, and so on, but it is also what enables, what makes it possible to generate new data out of this compression, embedding, and encoding of large quantities of data. So my remark would be in answering to your question, that is, it's a new entity in a visual culture that is largely infiltrated now by generative AI models. That would be perhaps the emphasis I would say. And concerning the question of the importance that I give to the question of words and images, connections with images and text, there you're also absolutely right that the most recent developments we're seeing in these generative AI models is the emergence more and more of forms of image generations that bypass the use of prompts through functions such as blend and also the other ones that you mentioned. Still, it seems to me that at least for the moment, and nobody of us knows how these models are going to evolve over the next few years, for the moment, what you're witnessing is still a major reconfiguration of the relations between images and words in such a way that did not exist before. This is absolutely new. It is, I don't know if it's going to last or if it's going to be something that is specific of the years, let's say 2022 to 2025 or something like that, but it's still a major phenomenon. And I also think that these algorithmic correlations between images and words play a very important role even in the generation of images that do not use prompts, because the latent spaces out of which these images are generated have been produced by models like CLIP, which worked with billions of image text connections stemming from databases such as Lion 5B and so on. So somewhere the connection between images and words is still operative. But you know, it's extremely difficult for all of us to make predictions about this. I also think that we're witnessing a kind of accelerated history in which even a period of 2 years may be an important moment in this history. Like GANs, for example, have been a very important phenomenon that is maybe kind of coming to an end, at least in the larger uses. But it's still a moment between, let's say, 2016, 17, and 2021 that has to be looked at as a moment in the history of generative AI. Just as when we study early cinema, we may consider the years, 1895 to 1901 as having a specificity to certain cameras, certain forms of capture, certain very early forms of in-camera editing that will then maybe disappear later. So we're witnessing an accelerated history that we need to study as such. This is what I believe.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful questions and answer. And okay, so okay, I'm reading the question posed by Dr. Jechol Park. So let me read it. Thank you for your great, very much inspiring talk. I'm especially intrigued by your idea of the latent space as a new historical a priori. You mentioned Deleuze's work on Foucault as the key theoretical reference for this idea. In that book, Deleuze discusses the two regimes Foucault is concerned with, which are knowledge and power. Knowledge is concerned with the relation between the visible and the sayable, as you mentioned, but Deleuze also discusses power, which concerns the relations between forces. In other words, by power, Deleuze means the micro-molecular level regime as compared to knowledge, which is the macro-level regime. My question is, what do you think Deleuze's discussion of power allows us to think about the latent space? Thank you.
I will just read the question in written, just 1 second, because it's a complex one.
Sure.
1 second only.
Sure.
Very, very interesting question. So thanks a lot to Jechol Park. Yes, of course, latent spaces are a way of encoding not only knowledge relations, but power relations, of course, as well. In encoding in latent space billions of connections between images and texts, in analyzing all them and in positioning all this into a statistical-based vector space, you do encode into them also the various power relations that are behind all those image-text connections that were found online. Now, what happens to those power relations once they re-emerge out of latent space in the form of image visualization is very interesting, because all the question of biases that we see appearing out of images generated from generative AI models are in a way symptoms or surface manifestations of these power relations that were encoded into it. I would also say that, as I said before, controlling latent spaces is a form of power, is a form of directing visualization possibilities towards certain other areas rather than others. It's also, as we see more and more, a way of making it impossible to visualize certain things. As you all have noticed, more and more limits, boundaries, no-go zones are introduced in these latent spaces. And so there's a massive form of control of possibilities of visualization that is completely opaque, because it is enacted by private companies that have absolutely no obligation to let us know why they banned certain prompts, why they allow certain images and not others. That's why it is very important, I think, to promote open access training sets, to produce latent spaces that can be integrated, completed, modified, expanded, or reduced. The plasticity of latent spaces, I think, is a crucial question moving forward. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you so much for your answer.
All right, so I think it's time to wrap up, and actually I have to leave for another appointment after the end of this event. I'm so sorry for that, but yeah, yeah, it was very illuminating to me to develop my own work on generative AI and how to understand it as a media coupled with various algorithmic operations in the mediation. So thank I like to thank Antonio and Rep and other people for attending this, and Antonio particularly for giving us the wonderful talk and thought-provoking talk on the present and future of our contemporary visual culture and the politics and aesthetics of and that they newly generate or shift. So let us give a big hand to and Antonio.
Thanks you. Thanks a lot to you, to Lev for participating, and to everyone for attending. Thanks really a lot.